Hey everybody, so the Civ 3 scenario editor is fantastic. It's intuitive, it's easy to use, but for some reason there are a lot of ways to accidentally ruin your scenario in this. The good news is there are about a dozen or so common pitfalls, and if you avoid those, you're pretty much generally going to have smooth sailing. So without further ado, I will present to you the 13 easiest ways to ruin your Civ 3 modding experience. So as a refresher, in-game appearances are indexed through the civilopedia. If you have to give units, civs, or buildings a civilopedia entry, you absolutely have to do that. And if you don't give any entry, the game will just crash on launch. If you mismanage that, it can cause problems. And I'll give you some examples of those problems. So one of them is that when you build a wonder, the game will play out a little cutscene. Like, when you build Temple of Artemis, you get a cutscene showing the Temple of Artemis. For this reason, you can't use an improvement civilopedia entry for a wonder or a small wonder, because when the game looks for a cutscene associated with that civilopedia entry, it doesn't exist, and the game will just crash because it can't find anything to play. So I'll show you guys how that works in practice. We'll go to, I think I actually did this one already. So yeah, I just made a version where we got this small wonder that we can build at the start, or maybe it's a regular wonder, it doesn't really matter too much. But I gave it the civilopedia entry for the bank. So you'll notice that this actually works fine, just looking at the civilopedia entry. But as soon as we build it, we're going to get this message. So they couldn't find the entry for Wonder Splash Building Bank, but there is no Wonder Splash for the Building Bank because the bank is no wonder. So the game just crashes. So it's fine to do it the other way around. If you want to give the bank, if you want to make the bank look like Magellan's Voyage or something like that, that's completely fine. Just don't make your small wonders or wonders look like improvements, like using the civilopedia entry for improvements, because then it'll crash the game. So next point on the list is the palace must be a building, not a small wonder. So this happens to everybody at some point. The palace is the first entry on the list. So when you just when you tune in, or when you switch over to the improvements tab, you're going to see the palace. And so you might, since you end up on this page, you might notice that it's an improvement, and you might think, wait, aren't I only allowed one palace? Shouldn't that be a small wonder? And then you just click on small wonder without thinking too much over what that will do. And then you go on the rest of your day, you make a billion other changes, and then suddenly you try to start the game, you try to start Civ 3 or start your scenario, and it crashes on launch. Or it crashes when you plant your city. Yeah, so that's because you made the palace a small wonder, and it looks for the splash art for the palace, which doesn't exist because the palace actually isn't a wonder. So even though the palace has a property that kind of resembles a wonder, like you can only build one in your empire, that's actually determined by the center of empire flag. It's not determined by being a small wonder. The palace is actually technically coded as an improvement, so don't change the fact that it's an improvement. Awesome. Next point on our list is that if you delete a unit, it will mess up unit producing buildings. So let's check out one of those buildings. At the end here, we got the Knights Templar. So it's producing Crusaders every 5 turns. Let's say, what happens if you delete the settler and the worker? So it now produces a Kura every 5 turns. And since it's not a coastal installation, it will do that even in inland cities. So I don't need to tell you that this is an awful, awful effect. And that's because the units produced thing, this is coded as just it just saves if you choose the 35th unit here, it just saves that number 35. It doesn't remember what actual unit you set it to. And so if you change the number of units on the list, it will change which unit is produced. So I'd advise you don't make your unit producing wonders until you're done all of the units that you want in the scenario. Or at least if you do delete a unit for whatever reason, make sure to readjust all of this stuff. So all of the unit producing wonders. There's actually a second reason, if you're just making minimal changes to the base game, I wouldn't recommend deleting the units. And that's because, look at this. For example, the spearmen. There are 100 different options that you have when you're choosing what you want a spearman to have. Let's say you want to make a custom defensive unit, and you're not using the spearmen in your scenario. So you could delete the spearmen and just make the new unit from scratch. Or you could just keep the spearmen around and then use it as a template if you end up needing to build a defensive unit. And the template is better, because if you're using the spearmen as a template, all you have to think is, how is this new unit different from a spearman? Well, maybe it has 2, 3 are the stats, and it's buildable by everybody. Great. That's a lot easier to do than figuring out which of these 100 flags does this new unit have and which one do they not have? Because some of them you might forget about, like the load flag, the pillage flag, the capture flag. These are all very important flags, and you're bound to get one of them wrong, or at least eventually if you're building units from scratch. So I'd recommend, if you're just making small changes, to leave some units around as templates, and so that you don't mess up the unit producing wonders. Great, so point number 4 on our list is, if you make world sizes small relative to the minimum spawn distance, things will get weird. So I know what you think. You don't want to spawn too close to the AI, but the issue is the map is only so big. There's only so much room for the players to spawn. And if you set them to spawn too far apart on a map that's too small, things will get weird because the game has to spawn you somewhere. So here's the world sizes tab. This is the distance between civs. So don't set that to be too small. Like, one thing that will happen is, for example, on Pangea maps, you'll end up with a lot of islands, potentially 2 or 3 players per game spawning on islands if you set this number high enough. So yeah, just be careful when you're navigating around that. Point number 5 on our list is that a unit must have both the upgrade unit ability and the upgrade to flag. So if you want to, I don't know, Archer upgrades to, I'll get into upgrade pathings later, but basically you need to set whatever you want this to be, and you also need to click this flag. So if you make a new unit and you set it to upgrade to something, it won't automatically let you upgrade to it. You have to include the upgrade unit flag. Hey everybody, so the 6th way to crash or ruin your game, this one isn't quite as dramatic as the other ones, but it will still cause a lot of issues, and in fact when I'm making multiplayer mods, this is the biggest one for me. So you have to be careful with unique units and the available to options flags in the editor. So the way that works is, if it's available to a civ, then that civ can build that unit. But that means it can get a bit complicated when you're editing unique units. So for example, let's say you didn't like England's unique unit. Let's say you don't like the man of war. You want to give the English a special longbow. Well, what you have to do then is you'd have to make it so England can build the frigate again, because if you just disable the man of war, then England can't build anything in place of the man of war. There's no frigate available to England. So you have to make it so they can build a frigate, and you also have to disable the regular longbow for England. Otherwise, they can just build an inferior version of their unique unit. And I mean, the human player might be smart enough not to do that, but the AI won't. They will build the inferior. They might build the inferior unit in some cases. So yeah, make sure you pay a lot of attention anytime you make any change to the unique units. Think about which civs this and which units this will affect, and make sure you do that carefully. So the next point on our list, point number 7, is the characteristic flags. Okay, this one isn't actually dramatic, but people really don't understand how these work. So I'm going to make this absolutely clear to you so that you don't have any confusion. So there are these 8 characteristic flags. Each of these flags do different things. So for wonders, what these flags do is they're the Golden Age trigger flags in the civilopedia. So if it says may give Golden Age to religious civs, it means that this flag is enabled. So that's wonders, but the flags also do things for other buildings aside from wonders. So if it has the militaristic flag, if it has it's half price for militaristic civs. If it has the scientific flag, it's half price for scientific civs. Same with religious and agricultural and seafaring, but not, crucially, for commercial, industrious, and expansionist. Don't give a building the commercial flag thinking it will be half price for commercial civs, because it doesn't work that way in the base game, and so it doesn't work that way in modded versions of the game too. The commercial flag doesn't do that. So you might think, why are we even given the option for choosing the commercial flag if it's not half price for commercial civs for buildings? Well, the answer to that is the flags do more things than just make the buildings half price. So the militaristic flag is what lets you build a building, a wonder, or a small wonder in the wartime mode. If a building or a wonder or a small wonder doesn't have this flag, you can't build it in wartime, and if it does, then you can. Industrious flag does nothing, I think, other than the Golden Age stuff. Same thing with the expansionist flag. Scientific flag, like I said, just half price for scientific civ. Same thing with religious. But commercial is actually quite interesting. So you know Smith's Trading Company, it makes certain buildings maintenance free. So there's this flag right here, pays for maintenance on all trade installations. Well, what counts as a trade installation is whatever building has this flag enabled. So if you enable this flag for the granary, then if you have Smith's Trading Company, you don't pay maintenance on granaries. So that's why that flag exists for commercial civs, even though it doesn't make the building half price. Don't enable this flag and think it makes the building half price. Agricultural, just half price for agricultural civs, and seafaring, yeah, I'll see if I'm missing anything. Yeah, I think that's everything. But yeah, keep these things in mind. So, point number 8 is that the building flags have restrictions. So, for example, the allows city size 2 is not available in your city if your city has access to fresh water. So, you can't build an aqueduct in a city that has access to fresh water, like a city that's next to a river or a lake, which is good because the aqueduct would do nothing. But if, let's say, you wanted to make a building that's like a hybrid granary plus aqueduct that has both of the effects, it has both the double city growth rate and allows city size 2, then you actually can't build this building in a city that is on fresh water, so next to a river or a lake. So if you were next to a river, like you wouldn't, and you did this with a granary, you wouldn't be able to build any granary at all because you can't build this granary because it has this city size level 2 flag enabled. So there's a few more like this. The city size 3 requires a city to be 7 plus population. So this is interesting in the Future Start multiplayer mod, where a lot of the wonders have this flag enabled. Like they act as hospitals, but you can't build them unless you're size 7 or higher. So let's say you wanted to give, like, let's say you're making Rome in the Rise of Rome scenario, and you want to make them have some really decked out buildings that do a bunch of things. And let's say you enable this, sure, this. It's a stealth attack, veteran ground units. Oh, and it allows city size 3. Well, I mean, if you want a building to have this effect, you can't build that building until size 7. So you just have to be careful for that. That's another flag. And the reduces corruption wonder ability. So, like I said, how the Center of Empire flag is tied to the fact that the palace works a particular way, you can only have one per empire. Same thing with the small wonder flag for reduces corruption. If I can find that one. I'm sure you can find it. So with this, here it is, reduces corruption, this one right here. So if you enable that flag, then you can't build whatever small wonder or wonder you choose unless you have a certain number of cities, and that number is whatever you need for the Forbidden Palace. I think it's like half of the OCN or something like that. It's some fraction of the OCN. So if you, let's say you wanted to give I don't know, like the pyramids, the ability to reduce corruption like that, you wouldn't be able to build that wonder until you had a certain number of cities, which could be quite big depending on the map size. So yeah, keep that in mind too. Number 9 is armies. Oh my god. So there are actually 5 different things in the editor that govern how armies work in your scenario. So there's the battle created unit slot in the general settings. There's the build army unit. If you go to units, then there's the leader and army AI strategies. So obviously you'll want to enable that if you want the AI to do good things with it. There's the build army and finish improvement options. They're here. And there's also the army and leader unit abilities. So the unit abilities are listed here. Yeah, like leader, army. So those are 5 different places where you can find things relating to an army. So if you are changing literally anything in your scenario about how armies work or about how great leaders work, you have to make sure you keep all of these different things in mind. So for example, let's say we don't want, when you win a battle with an elite unit, we don't want there to be a chance that you get a leader. Let's say we want it to be that there's a chance you get an ICBM, because that'd be kind of funny. So what would happen if you just launched the game without checking anything else? That's funny land. So notice we can actually build the leader right now, because the leader is no longer the battle created unit. And so because it's not a battle created unit, you can just build it. So you have to keep all of these things in mind and make sure you mess with all these settings. I'm not sure I understand how all of these 5 different things work and affect how leaders work. I'm still unclear about how do you make it so you can like rush a small wonder but not a regular wonder? Because the scientific leader can do both and the army great leader can do one. Anyway, I'm not sure how they all work, but make sure you keep them all in mind when you're editing your scenario. Otherwise, the scenario is just not going to work the way you want it to. Hey people, mistake number 10 has to do with the X and the Y values on the Civ Advanced screen in the scenario editor. So let's check those out now. So if you go to Civilization Advances, you'll see these X and Y, and if you check the help tool, it'll tell you exactly what these do. So that's why I recommend checking out the help tool, because otherwise, how would you know? I guess I could tell you. What they correspond with is the physical location of where this particular tech appears on the tech tree. So you'll notice that ironworking and bronzeworking have the same Y value, pretty much the same Y value. So the Y is the vertical axis, and the X is the horizontal axis. So the bigger the X value, the more to the right the tech will appear physically on the tech screen. So you can't just leave these values blank, or you can't just set them to something ridiculous. You have to set them to something that the player can actually physically click on. If you set it somewhere off screen, then the human player will not be able to select that tech, and they will not be able to research that tech. So make sure to keep that in mind. Point number 11 is set the correct number of players. So if you go to scenario properties, there's the number of players option if you do custom player data. So if in scenarios where you intend a certain number of players to play, make sure you select that. Note that there is a bug with the world size. So often the number of players will default to whatever the middle world size is. So in this case, it's 8, so we'll default back to 8. But if you set the standard size to be lower, then it will default back to, say, 6, if you set that to be 6. So the issue here is when it resets like this, it will actually erase all the player data for player 7 and player 8. So let's say I have a scenario where everybody starts in the second era. Often the game will reset, and you'll have to re-enter those values basically anytime you make a change to the scenario. Anytime you're putting out a new patch of the scenario, you have to check, do I have the correct number of players? And do I have and change all the stuff you had changed here so that corresponds to what you want it to have. Next point on the list is number 12, which is to make sure to use the option to specify a scenario search folder. So the scenario search folder can be seen here. These last 2 points are about people who are doing custom graphics and animations and that kind of thing. So it's right here. The way that this works is when the game is looking for assets, like the way the units or whatever appear on the map, they're first going to go to whatever you set the scenario search folder to be. After that, if the unit that they're looking for is not there, it will go to whatever the scenario title is. So this scenario is titled 13 editor tips. So it would look for a folder that says 13 editor tips. If it can't find the unit it's looking for there, it will go to just the regular game of Civilization 3. So the Spearman obviously is in the base files for Civ 3, and so if there's a civilopedia entry for Spearman asking for an animation for Spearman, it will find those files within the original folders for Civ 3. So what all of this means is that you should include the scenario search folder because otherwise it depends entirely on the name of the BIC. And this is something we run into. For example, with the modern multiplayer scenario, there are a bunch of patches. We change things quite regularly. And that's why I set the scenario search folder to be called modern. Because if I set the scenario search folder to be because if I don't have a scenario search folder, then it's just going to look for something called modern 1.17. And then I'd have to rename this folder every time I change the name of the BIC. This happened to me once that someone actually sent me a scenario they wanted me to play on my YouTube channel, and they called it just UU. And I renamed it Wayla's UU because there's a multiplayer mod also called UU, and the scenario wouldn't run, or at least it wouldn't run properly, because the name of this folder was different from the folder of the BIC. If you have no scenario search folder, to clarify, you have no scenario search folder, this name here has to match the name of the BIC that you're trying to run. If you do have a scenario search folder, people can rename the BIC whatever you want, and as long as this information here is accurate, it will find the right assets for you. And our final mistake that will mess up everything in your mod is to make sure that this configuration settings file in the unit asset folder has the same name as the civilopedia entry, minus the dashes. So I saved the most technical stuff for last, you can tell. Let's look for units. So let's say the unit is, we'll do modern as an example. This is the multiplayer mod that I edit. So, this is the skirmisher, It uses the civilopedia entry for the rifleman. So when the game looks for assets, it's going to go to, because remember the scenario search folder is modern, so it'll go into scenarios, into modern. art, units, and then rifleman, because the civilopedia entry is set to rifleman. And as I mentioned, all of the art and the animations and all that stuff is indexed through the civilopedia. So it will go into this folder, but unless this file right here is named the same thing as the civilopedia entry, if there's two words in the civilopedia, like if it was modern rifleman, it would be an underscore there. Ignore the underscore in that case. If this name right here is different from the name of this file right here, like rifleman, then the asset is not going to load when you boot up the game. So what I did here is I made the skirmisher look like the GIs from the World War II in the Pacific scenario. And I just copied those assets into here, but instead of having this being called GI infantry or American infantry or whatever it's called, I had to rename it to rifleman because that's the civilopedia entry I'm using. So when you're downloading custom assets for your own scenarios, make sure that you match the civilopedia entry name with the name of this configuration files thing. Of course, this is going to get more complicated if you start doing custom civilopedia entries. Like if you call your unit, let's say we called it skirmisher, we'd have to make a new civilopedia entry for the skirmisher, and then we'd rename this to skirmisher so that it matches the civilopedia entry. So yeah, that's all the tips I have for you guys. Let me know if you enjoy content relating to modding stuff, and I'll see you guys next time.